The elevator doors were closing. The French delegation's lead was already inside his assistant, holding the luggage the deal dead on the floor of the 32nd floor conference room. Carolyn Briggs stood there, with her hand pressed against the door sensor, speaking in English, to a man who had stopped listening 20 minutes ago. Nobody in that hallway knew what Henri Moreau had just said in French. Nobody except the man standing 10 steps away, holding a mop, wearing a maintenance badge, the same man her employees had laughed at that morning. What happened next, none of them saw coming. Cole Hargrove arrived at Aldrin & Company every morning before the sun came up. He had a routine that never changed badge: in at 5:15 collect the supply cart from the basement closet, ride the service elevator to the 32nd floor, and begin working through the hallways while the building was still empty and quiet. By the time the first employees arrived at 8, the floors were clean, the trash bins were empty, and Cole was already invisible. That was how it worked. That was how it had worked for 2 years. He was 35 years old and had the kind of face that people looked past without meaning to. Not unfriendly, not worn down, just unremarkable in the way that men become when the world stops asking them questions. He kept his uniform neat, his cart organized, his head down. He did the work without complaint and clocked out without conversation. Most of the staff on 32 didn't know his name. A few called him the Janitor. 1 or 2 called him nothing at all. What they didn't see was what happened at 5 in the morning before any of it. Cole would wake up quietly so he wouldn't disturb Nora, his 8-year-old daughter sleeping in the next room. He'd make 2 bowls of oatmeal, one for her, one for himself, eat his standing at the kitchen counter, then go wake her gently. She was a deep sleeper like her mother had been. He'd carry her half awake to get dressed, braid her hair the way she liked it, and walk her 3 buildings down to Ruthie's apartment. Ruthie was 71, retired, and had been watching Nora since she was barely old enough to walk. She never asked Cole for more than he could give. That kind of person was rare, and he knew it. The walk to the train after dropping Nora off was the quietest part of his day. 12 minutes from Ruthie's door to the platform. He didn't listen to music. He didn't look at his phone. He just walked, and sometimes he thought about nothing, and sometimes he thought about everything. And most mornings, he couldn't tell the difference. He had learned in the years since his wife died that there was a certain kind of grief that didn't announce itself. It just lived in the spaces between things, between waking and working, between dropping his daughter off and picking her up, between who he used to be and who he was now. There was one thing in his locker at Aldrin & Company that didn't belong with the rest of his life there. A small French paperback, its spine creased and soft from handling its pages, marked at various points with folded corners. He kept a second copy of the same book at home on the kitchen shelf. Nora had seen that one had asked about it once, and he had told her only that it was something he liked to read. The one at the office was older, more worn. He had owned it for over a decade. Nobody at work had ever noticed it. Nobody had ever opened his locker. Nobody had ever asked. The internal memo went out on a Tuesday. Cole saw it posted on the staff bulletin board near the supply room, a single printed sheet, the kind that got pinned up and ignored by most people. But the words on it were not the kind that got ignored. Dumont Group. Paris. Partnership review. Figures that even abbreviated made the numbers feel significant. The memo said the delegation would arrive in 4 days. It said all senior staff were to be available. It said this was the most important week Aldrin & Company had seen in years. That afternoon, Carolyn Briggs called a meeting. Cole was in the hallway outside the conference room when it started pushing his cart slowly enough to hear the door close. Through the wall, he could make out her tone, even when he couldn't make out her words. Clipped precise, the kind of voice that didn't leave room for questions. She was 44, the kind of executive who had built her reputation on not needing anyone to finish her sentences. Cole had never spoken directly to her in 2 years. She had looked at him once, maybe twice, in the way a person looks at a piece of furniture, acknowledging its presence, without registering it as anything that required attention. He finished the hallway and moved on. That evening, after Nora was asleep, He sat at the kitchen table alone. He opened the French paperback, the home copy, the one Nora had seen on the shelf, and turned to a page near the back, not to read it, but because there was something tucked there. A photograph. Small, slightly faded the edges, soft from years of being handled. Two people standing under the awning of a cafe on a wet Paris street. The woman was laughing at something out of frame. The man beside her was younger than Cole was now, but recognizable. Same jaw, same stillness in the eyes. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he closed the book and set it flat on the table, and didn't open it again that night. The morning the French delegation arrived, the 32nd floor felt different before anyone said a word. There were fresh flower arrangements at the reception desk that hadn't been there the day before. The glass on the conference room walls had been cleaned. Cole had done that himself the evening prior. The staff moved with a kind of performed composure, the way people move when they're aware of being watched, but trying not to show it. Cole was working the far end of the hallway near the elevator bank when the group from sales clustered near the reception area. There were 4 of them, young, dressed sharply, talking in the way people talk when they want to be overheard. One of them, a young man named Drew, who worked as a sales assistant and had the easy confidence of someone who had never been ignored in a room, said something that landed hard enough to cut through the ambient noise of the floor. He said it loud enough to be funny. He nodded toward Cole with a smirk and said, "Hey, careful. Don't let him mop the French guy's shoes when they walk in." The group laughed. It wasn't vicious. That was almost worse. It was casual, the kind of joke that doesn't require the target to be a person. Carolyn Briggs was standing 6 feet away. She heard it. Cole saw her hear it. She glanced in his direction, not at him exactly, but near him, and then she turned back to her phone. Cole kept his hands on the cart. He kept moving. The elevator opened. Henri Moreau stepped out first. 58 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who carried authority without performing it. His assistant followed, and 2 members of his team behind that. The floor shifted into formal posture. Introductions were made. Hands were shaken. And then Moreau said something in French to his assistant, low and unhurried, not meant for the room, but not hidden either. He said, "Ces gens manquent vraiment de classe. These people truly lack class." Nobody on the floor reacted. Nobody understood. The introductions continued. Carolyn smiled and gestured toward the conference room, and the delegation followed, and Drew straightened his jacket, and the hallway returned to its curated calm. Nobody noticed that Cole had gone completely still. Nobody noticed the way his grip on the cart handle had tightened, or that his eyes had followed Moreau for exactly the 3 seconds it took the man to cross the floor and disappear through the conference room door. Cole stood there a moment longer than he needed to. Then he pushed the cart forward and went back to work. The negotiation began at 9:30 in the glass-walled conference room. Cole could see it from the hallway, not clearly, but enough. The table was long, the chairs were full, and the hired interpreter sat to the left of Carolyn Briggs with a notepad and a posture that communicated readiness. He was young, maybe 26, with the kind of credentials that looked good on paper. Cole had seen him arrive that morning with a leather portfolio and a firm handshake for everyone he met. He seemed like exactly the right person for the job. He was not. Within the first 30 minutes, the cracks were already visible. Cole was stationed just outside the conference room, restocking the water station along the hallway wall, close enough to the glass that the voices carried through. The interpreter's French was technically correct, in the way that textbook French is correct. Clean pronunciation, standard vocabulary, none of the weight that the language actually carries when it's spoken between people who mean business. Moreau would say something precise and layered, and what came back in English would be flatter, slightly off in its implications, like a copy of a copy. The Dumont Group representatives exchanged glances with each other, small ones, the kind that don't need words. Cole restocked the water station twice before anyone noticed he was still there. He moved slowly, deliberately, because there was no reason to rush, and because if he was being honest with himself, he was listening, Every mistranslation landed in him like a small, specific weight. When the interpreter rendered Moreau's phrase about conditions prealable, preconditions, as simply requirements, losing the entire legal distinction between the two, Cole set down the water pitcher and stood still for a moment. The meaning wasn't just softened, it was changed, and nobody in that room knew it except him. Carolyn Briggs sat at the head of the table with the composed expression of someone managing a situation she was beginning to lose control of. She nodded at the right moments. She asked clarifying questions through the interpreter. But Moreau's responses kept coming back slightly wrong, and each wrong answer required another question, and the meeting was moving in circles that looked like progress, but weren't. Cole watched her through the glass. He watched the way her jaw tightened every time she had to ask something a second time. Then he picked up his cart and moved down the hall. The lunch break came at 12:15. The Dumont group was escorted to a reserved dining room on the floor below. Most of the Aldrin staff scattered to their desks or the break room. The 32nd floor hallway went quiet, the way it only did on weekends, that particular kind of empty, that made the building feel larger than it was. Cole gathered the used water glasses from outside the conference room and stacked them on a tray. He was carrying the tray toward the supply room when he heard footsteps behind him, unhurried, deliberate, not the quick clip of someone with somewhere to be. Cole didn't turn around immediately. He set the tray down on the supply cart and began organizing the glasses. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice came from behind him, low and conversational in French. Vous comprenez ce qu'on dit, n'est-ce pas? You understand what we're saying, don't you? Cole turned around. Henri Moreau was standing near the window, at the end of the hall, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the Chicago skyline. He wasn't looking at Cole, but the question had been directed at him. There was no one else in the hallway, and the tone made that clear. Cole looked at the man for a moment. Then he answered in French, his voice level and unhurried, chaque mot. Every word. Moreau turned then. He looked at Cole the way a person looks at something they weren't expecting to find, not with surprise exactly, but with a recalibration. He studied Cole's face for a moment, then asked where he had learned. Cole told him he had lived in Paris for 8 years, a long time ago. Moreau nodded slowly. He asked what Cole had done there. Cole said he had worked as a military interpreter. Moreau was quiet for a moment after that, the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable, but isn't casual either. Then the older man said in French, almost to himself, I understand why you haven't said anything, but silence has its own cost. Cole didn't respond to that. There wasn't a response that felt honest and also safe. Moreau held his gaze for another beat, then turned and walked back toward the stairwell door. The conversation was over in under 4 minutes. Cole stood in the empty hallway and looked at the tray of glasses on his cart. Something in the architecture of the afternoon had shifted, though he couldn't yet say in which direction. The afternoon session started at 2. Cole was assigned to the floor again, cleaning the bathrooms at the far end of the hall, keeping the common areas clear. He didn't have a view of the conference room from that position, but he could hear the quality of the silence that came from that direction. A tense negotiation has a particular sound, even through walls, and distance. It's the sound of people talking too carefully, trying too hard, the gaps between sentences slightly longer than they should be. That sound got worse as the afternoon went on. At 3:40, the door opened. Cole heard it from the bathroom hallway. Then he heard voices. Not conversation, but the kind of raised, overlapping speech that comes when something has gone wrong and everyone is reacting at once. He pushed his cart into the main hallway and saw the conference room door standing open. Moreau was on his feet inside. His posture had changed, straight, formal, closed. He was speaking in French, and the interpreter was visibly struggling his pen, moving frantically over the notepad. Carolyn stood at the head of the table, and for the first time that day, she looked like she didn't know what to do next. What happened? Cole pieced together from position, The interpreter had mistranslated a liability clause, not a minor error, not a question of nuance, but a fundamental misreading of what Dumont Group was and was not agreeing to accept. Moreau had caught it when his own legal counsel leaned over and pointed to the discrepancy in the French language draft. The interpreter tried to correct himself. The correction made it worse. Moreau set his copy of the document down on the table with a quiet finality and said that his delegation would be withdrawing from the negotiation, effective immediately, pending a full internal review of the process. The room didn't erupt. It went the other direction, that specific stillness that comes after something irreversible has been said. Carolyn tried to interject. The interpreter tried to translate her interjection. Moreau's assistant began gathering documents from the table. Within minutes, the Dumont Group was filing out of the conference room and into the hallway, and the Aldrin staff were left standing there, looking at each other and the floor. Drew came out into the hallway, fast, his face the color of dry concrete. He was pulling at his collar, muttering under his breath, the practiced confidence of the morning completely gone. He stopped near the elevator bank and said to no one in particular, "God, if we just had someone who actually spoke French." He said it the way people say things when desperation makes them careless with their words. Then he looked up and saw Cole standing 10 feet away with a supply cart. The two of them made eye contact. Drew looked at Cole, at the uniform, at the cart, at the maintenance badge, and something moved across his face. Some thought that flickered, and then was dismissed before it fully formed. He shook his head and walked back toward the conference room. Not cruelly, just without believing. Cole watched him go. There was a feeling in his chest that he recognized, not anger, not exactly. Something quieter and older than anger. The feeling of being looked at and not seen. He had carried it for a long time. It had become familiar the way a scar becomes familiar. You stop noticing it until something presses directly on it, and then you notice it all at once. Moreau and his team came through the hallway 10 minutes later. The assistant was carrying 2 bags. Moreau walked at a measured pace, not rushed, not lingering the walk of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Carolyn fell into step beside him, her voice controlled and low, speaking in English, trying to find the right words to hold the situation together for another few minutes. Moreau listened without turning his head toward her. When she finished, he answered in French, calmly, clearly, without hostility. He said that what had occurred that day was not only a problem of translation, it was a problem of regard. That the manner in which his delegation had been received from the moment they arrived reflected something about the culture of this company that he could not in good conscience attach the Dumont name to. Then he said, "Je suis désolé." I am sorry. Carolyn did not understand a single word of it. Cole knew because he was standing near the elevator bank with a half-full trash liner in his hands, and he watched her face as Moreau spoke. She was searching his expression for information, trying to read the tone, trying to find anything she could respond to. She found nothing she could use. The elevator arrived. Moreau's assistant stepped in. Moreau followed. Carolyn pressed her hand to the door sensor to hold it open. She looked at him. She had one more chance to say something, and she had nothing left in the right language to say it. Cole stood 10 steps away. He heard everything Moreau had said. He felt the weight of the trash liner in his hand. He thought about Nora, her face in the morning, half asleep, trusting him completely. He thought about the photograph in the book, the wet Paris street, the woman laughing at something out of frame. He thought about 8 years of his life that nobody in this building knew existed. He thought about the word Moreau had used that afternoon cost. Then Cole set the trash liner down on the floor next to his cart. He straightened up, and he walked toward the elevator. He said it in French. 2 words, clean and direct, aimed at the back of a man who was already halfway into an elevator. "Monsieur Moreau." The voice that came out of Cole was not loud. It didn't need to be. There was something in the quality of it, the pronunciation, the register, the complete absence of hesitation that cut through the ambient noise of the hallway, the way a struck tuning fork cuts through a crowded room. Everything stopped. Carolyn's hand was still on the door sensor. Moreau turned his head. He looked at Cole the way a person looks when something has confirmed a suspicion they weren't sure they were allowed to have. His expression didn't shift dramatically. It settled, like a man who had been waiting for a door to open and was now watching it open. He stepped back out of the elevator. His assistant followed without being told. The doors closed behind them, and the hallway, which had been holding its breath without knowing it, stayed that way. Cole walked toward them at the same pace he had used all day, no performance in it. He stopped a few feet from Moreau and spoke in French, his voice steady and unhurried. He said he understood why Moreau was leaving. He said he had no right to ask him to stay. But he had been in that hallway all day, and he had heard the negotiation in both languages, and what had been lost in the translation was not just words. It was the actual substance of what Dumont Group had proposed and what Aldrin was capable of offering in return. He said those two things were not as far apart as the afternoon had made them appear. Carolyn stepped forward. "What are you saying?" Her voice was controlled but thin at the edges. She was looking at Cole the way she might look at something she had walked past 100 times and suddenly couldn't explain. Cole turned to her and answered in English, meeting her eyes directly for what was in 2 years of working on the same floor, the first real exchange between them. "I'm saying what should have been said this morning, Ms. Briggs." He held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to Moreau. Moreau looked at Cole for a long moment. Then he looked at the maintenance badge on Cole's chest. Then at the trash liner Cole had set down near the elevator bank. Then back at Cole's face. He asked in French how long Cole had worked at this company. Cole told him 2 years. Moreau asked if anyone here knew he spoke French. Cole said no. Moreau asked why not. Cole answered simply. No one had asked. The hallway was completely still. Even the ambient hum of the building seemed to have pulled back. Moreau was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said in French that he wanted to try the last hour again, and that he wanted this man at the table. What followed was not a triumphant reversal. It was work. Careful, specific, unglamorous work. Cole sat at the conference table for the first time, not to clean it, not to set water glasses on it, but in a chair with a legal pad someone had pushed in front of him and a pen he had taken from his own shirt pocket. Moreau's team filed back in. Carolyn sat at the head of the table. The rest of the Aldrin staff took their seats without speaking. Cole started from the clause that had broken the afternoon. He went through it in both directions, French to English, English to French, until both sides were looking at the same document and seeing the same thing. It took 11 minutes just for that one clause. Nobody rushed him. Moreau's legal counsel asked 2 clarifying questions. Cole answered both without referring to any notes, because he didn't have any notes, because everything he needed was already in his head from 8 years of doing exactly this kind of work in rooms that mattered. Carolyn watched him. Cole didn't look at her while he worked, but he was aware of her attention. The way you're aware of weather, something in the room had changed direction. The negotiation moved differently once the language was clean. Moreau's team stopped exchanging glances. The questions became more direct, and the answers came back with their original weight intact. When there was a point of genuine disagreement, a timeline for implementation that Dumont wanted shortened and Aldrin needed flexibility on Cole, translated both positions exactly without softening either side, and let the 2 parties look at the gap between them and decide what to do with it. That was the job. Not to close the gap himself, just to make sure both sides could actually see it. By 5:15, the document was revised and reviewed. Moreau's counsel made 2 small notations in the margin. Carolyn initialed them. Moreau signed on behalf of Dumont Group. There was no applause, no relief that spilled over into noise, just the quiet, specific sound of something being completed. Moreau capped his pen and set it on the table. He looked across at Carolyn and said in English for the first time all day, "Thank you." Then he looked at Cole and said the same thing in French. The Dumont group left at 5:30. The elevator closed. The floor exhaled. Staff members drifted back toward their desks or stood in clusters near the windows, speaking in the low, careful tones of people who had just watched something they didn't fully understand, but knew was significant. Cole stayed in the conference room for a few minutes, stacking the revised documents into a neat pile, returning the pens to the center of the table, straightening the chairs. Old habit. The room looked the same as it had that morning. He was the one who was different, though he couldn't have said yet exactly how. He picked up the legal pad and looked at the notes he had taken during the session. Shorthand, a mix of French and English, the kind of notations that would be illegible to anyone but him. He set it back on the table. It wasn't his to take. He walked to the door. Carolyn Briggs was standing in the hallway. The rest of the floor had thinned out, and she was alone near the windows looking out at the city. The evening light had come up while they were in the room, and Chicago below was beginning to shift into its nighttime version, the streetlights finding their rhythm, the traffic changing its character. Carolyn turned when she heard Cole's footsteps. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Something in her face was different, not softened exactly, but rearranged. She was a woman who made decisions quickly and rarely second-guessed them, and Cole could see in the particular stillness of her expression that she was doing something she didn't often do, sitting with, something she hadn't resolved yet. She didn't apologize. Cole hadn't expected her to. What she said was, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Her voice was direct, genuinely asking without the authority she usually carried in it. Cole looked out the window for a moment. The lights below were steady and indifferent. "No one ever asked Miss Briggs," he said. He said it without bitterness, without edge, just the plain, verifiable truth of it. Carolyn held that answer for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing something away permanently. She looked at him. One more time, really looked the way she hadn't in 2 years, and then she walked back down the hall toward her office without another word. Cole understood that. It was more honest than most apologies. Drew was standing near the far end of the hallway. Cole didn't know how long he had been there. The young man looked different than he had that morning, less polished, more present, like something had been stripped away that he hadn't realized he was wearing. He didn't say anything when Cole walked past, but when Cole reached him, Drew gave a single small nod, the kind that doesn't require a name or a reason. Cole nodded back. Then he kept walking. He picked Nora up from Ruthie's apartment at 6:40. The little girl came through the door, at a run the way she always did, arms out, momentum, unchecked, completely certain. He would catch her. He did. He lifted her up and held her with both arms, and she looped her hands around the back of his neck and pressed her cheek against his. She smelled like outside air and whatever Ruthie had made for dinner. "Did anything good happen today?" she asked, pulling back to look at his face. Nora had always read him accurately, even when she was very small. She could tell when something had happened, even when he hadn't decided yet whether to talk about it. Cole carried her down the hallway toward the exit. He thought about how to answer. Then he decided to tell the truth, which was something he had been doing less of lately, in ways he was only now beginning to notice. He told her that something had happened at work, that he had helped some people talk to each other when they couldn't find the right words. Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "In French?" she asked. He looked at her. "How did you know I spoke French?" She shrugged with the casual certainty of a child who has simply always known something. "Because of the book. The one on the kitchen shelf. The one with the picture in it." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes in French. They walked to the train, on the way for the first time since he couldn't remember when Cole talked. Not about work, about Paris. About the streets near the river in the early morning when the city was wet and quiet. About the market on the corner, where he used to buy bread before the week started. About the cafe where he had met Nora's mother, and how she had laughed at something he said he still couldn't remember what, and how that laugh had been the beginning of everything. Nora listened without interrupting, which was rare for her. She walked beside him, and held his hand, and listened. At the kitchen table that night after dinner, she pulled a piece of paper from her backpack and drew while Cole washed the dishes. He dried his hands and came to look. She had drawn a tower, tall, slightly lopsided, recognizable, and two figures standing in front of it, one tall and one small. Underneath, in the careful printed letters of a child who is still learning how much space each one takes up, she had written Dad and me. Cole stood at the table and looked at it for a long time. The French paperback on the kitchen shelf, the copy Nora had always known about the one with the photograph inside it, was right there, 3 feet away in plain sight. He had kept it there for years without explanation. She had simply looked at it and understood something about him that he hadn't found the words to say. He sat down across from her. "Do you want to learn some French?" he asked. Nora looked up. She had his eyes steady, watching. "Yes," she said, like it was obvious, like it had always been the plan. Cole pulled the paper toward him, turned it over to the blank side, and wrote one word at the top: "Bonjour." "That one's easy," Nora said. "I know," Cole said. "We'll start there anyway."